All right, happy 4th of July to everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to explain to you the absolute circus of the case known as Nix versus Hedden. Again, another case where the court attempts to disambiguate a term, and the way in which they do so I think is very interesting, as well as just a little bit entertaining. So I have here pulled up on my computer the Tariff Act of 1883, and it provides for certain taxes to be levied on certain imports. And so I'd like for you to see here that one of the provisions of this act is that vegetables in their natural state or in salt or in brine, not specially enumerated or provided for in this act, 10% ad valorem. Now, ad valorem is a phrase that basically means that it's up to a certain person to kind of eyeball the number of produce coming into the country and to come up with some estimate, some numbers for tax purposes about exactly how much produce is being imported. So you would take your produce to a certain figure and he would look at it and say, oh, that looks like about 5,000 kilograms of whatever. And so you should pay tax on 5,000 kilograms. That's what ad valorem means. Now, in addition to vegetables, which were taxed if they were in their natural state, there is a certain list of things that could be brought into the country, and you wouldn't have to pay anything for it. It's on a free list. And on the list of things that you could import into the country for free included fruit plants and fruits, green, ripe, or dried, not specially enumerated or provided for in this act. Well, what do you think the legal controversy we'll be examining today involved? Well, it involved a guy who attempted to bring tomatoes into the country. Let me pull up the case now. I really hope that you can see this. It looks like you can, as far as I can tell. So what has this person done? Well, somebody has brought into the country a sizable portion of tomatoes, and they've come to New York, and the wharf master there has done exactly what he's supposed to do in his capacity as a wharf master. He's eyeballed the number of tomatoes coming in, and he's assessed to the importer a tax of 10% ad valorem. On the grounds that the tomatoes are vegetables and as such are subject to this 10% ad valorem tax. Well, the importer, I think, even though he's upset about having to pay this tax, has done something that's pretty admirable and serves as a good life lesson for all of us. When the government or someone specially protected by the government demands payment of you, it's always better to pay first and then sue for return of what you think you've wrongfully paid. In contrast, it's probably a bad idea to withhold payment from such figures. I've never heard of anything going well for people who withhold payment. It's always better to pay first and sue for return if you think it was unjustly taken from you. And that's exactly what the importer has done here. So he has this going for him, at least, that he's paid the taxes under protest and is now suing for them back. And why is he suing? Well, he thinks that tomatoes are considered fruits. And because they're considered fruits, he shouldn't have to pay this tax on vegetables. So that's what the controversy surrounds. And to me, it seems like kind of a circus sideshow. What happens in the following case? When the case goes to court, the proceedings are absolutely absurd. You have people basically whipping out their dictionaries and reading various things into the record. Let me just switch my screen share for just a moment. I want a new share, and I want this PowerPoint. So the first thing that they're going to do is read into the court record the definition of fruit. Now, as a little bit of a legal nerd, I couldn't help but laugh when I saw what came up when I Googled this. A fruit is defined as the sweet and fleshy product of a tree or other plant that contains seed and can be eaten as food. And if you just stop there, it looks to me as though this definition is broad enough to include even tomatoes, even things like cucumbers and eggplants and squash. But what's funny is that when you Google the word fruit and you attempt to define it, what does Google bring up here? They have this category of stuff. I don't know if you can see it, but it has things like, maybe that's a lime or a green apple, I'm not sure, but that's definitely an apple of some kind. I see a watermelon and a kiwi. Unsure about this kind of a yellow fleshy fruit right here, but an orange is lingering in the background, maybe a pear. Likewise, over in this picture, I see a slice of grapefruit and a lemon. Maybe that's an apple, I'm not sure. I see some grapes, a pineapple, tangerines, oranges, lots of citrus. In any case, what we don't see in these pictures are avocados or tomatoes even, or parsnips, or cucumbers, even though maybe some of these things at least could be subsumed under this definition of fruit. All right, now let's look at the next term that's read into the record. Vegetable. Here, a vegetable is defined as a plant or part of a plant used as food, such as a cabbage, potato, carrot, or bean. And when you zoom in on these pictures of cabbages, you see things like turnips and eggplants and, oh, I don't know, it's too blurry for me to see, but I see peppers. And in fact, call me crazy, but I think I might see some tomatoes here as well. So it's interesting again, to me as a nerd, how these vegetables are kind of grouped together, at least in our internet searches, right? So after reading the definitions of fruit and vegetable into the record, you have this one clown come along, and the clown testifies that in trade, basically trade has no special definitions of the terms fruit or vegetable. They are the same as they are in ordinary language. Now, at first, I thought this person was being a little bit silly. Maybe they're saying something a little bit more innocuous. I initially took them to be saying that uh, the dictionary definition of fruit and vegetable did not diverge from how they're used in trade. And I think there is a reading on which it looks like the witness here is saying, no, we use the term fruit in trade to refer to anything that has seeds, even if it's a tomato or a cucumber. We'll use the term fruit to refer to those things just as the botanists do. Because after all, these definitions I've just read to you are botanical definitions that have been kind of devised by scientists to classify things in an orderly way. But it remains to be seen whether there is an ordinary language counterpart of the term fruit and vegetable, which might diverge from the way in which scientists use this term. So that's what's under question here, is whether there are specialty meanings of these terms that scientists might use, and whether those terms diverge in their extensions from the way that ordinary people talk about them. So then, after you have the definitions of fruit and vegetable being read into the record, the defense, in other words, the government, in support of the wharf master who levied this tax on a tomato, they're going to read into the record definitions of fruits like eggplant. Here, the modern definition is just that an eggplant is the purple egg-shaped fruit of a tropical old world plant which is eaten as a vegetable. So is it a fruit that's eaten as a vegetable? What is this difference? It looks to me like there's a term fruit that refers to one thing, and then there's this conception of vegetable in which a fruit can be eaten as a vegetable. So it's quite confusing. The defense representing the wharf master will then read the definition of pea into the record, which is a spherical green seed eaten as a vegetable or as a pulse when dried. I don't know what a pulse is, but at least I know what it is to eat something as a vegetable. I'm getting the sense of what it is from the last definition. And in defense of the wharf master, somebody will read into the record the definition of squash. The edible gourd, the flesh of which may be cooked and eaten as a vegetable. So it's interesting to me because I can think of all the things that squash, peas, eggplants, cucumbers, and perhaps tomatoes all have in common. They're all they all have edible flesh, and each of these things contain the seed of the plant from which they originated. But they aren't sweet, and there's this way in which they're eaten, which is as a vegetable. So there's some kind of special way in which these things are usually eaten. In contrast, the plaintiff, representing, I think, Nix, is going to read into the record the definition of tomato. A tomato is defined as a glossy red or occasionally yellow pulpy edible fruit that is eaten as a vegetable or in a salad. So it's not clear to me of what help this will be because it is again a fruit eaten as a vegetable, which doesn't really help us get at the meaning of the terms fruit and vegetable as they appear in the Tariff Act of 1883. The plaintiff will further, for some reason, read into the record the definition of turnip, and I have no idea how this is supposed to help his cause. But the definition of turnip is a round root with white or cream flesh, which is eaten as a vegetable and also has edible leaves. I'm just not seeing the deliberative root between this and some argument for the plaintiff here who's trying to get his money back. So, what a spectacle. In court, all you have are these parties reading definitions out of a dictionary about what a fruit is, never pausing to consider ordinary language or how terms are used. I'm not sure if this would have occurred to anybody, but when one does philosophy, one typically does take a term that is ordinarily used in ordinary language, and then they attempt to try to specify the meaning of this term by looking at the way in which it's used and looking at various extensions. And a natural thought is that lexicographers who are responsible for the creation of dictionaries oftentimes do not formulate definitions that are sensitive to the various ways in which terms can be used, and definitions are very often inadequate. Here, at least, we see some sense in which something could be eaten as a vegetable, though it is a fruit in some other sense. So, what exactly is the meaning of fruit and vegetable as they appear in the Tariff Act? And how is this question settled? Well, you might have thought that because this case is at the Supreme Court, which is the very highest court of the land, there's a bit of a pickle because appellate courts do not consider new evidence. Think about any kind of proceeding. The evidence that's presented to the trial court and which the trial court accepts pinions, in many ways, appellate courts who would later review the decision of that court. In other words, an appellate court is not going to look at the evidence that was accepted by a trial court and tinker with that evidence in some way. Whatever the trial court accepts as evidence goes for the appellate court as well. Though there are some exceptions to that, and this case provides us with a prime example of an exception. The exception is going to be one of judicial notice. When something is so commonly known that it needs no evidential basis, judges are permitted, at the appellate level even, to take notice of this fact. And what the judges in this case will say is that it is common knowledge that vegetables include tomatoes, and tomatoes are vegetables. This is because there's a certain way in which vegetables and fruits are treated. Now, these are things that are spoken about in generalities, which ultimately will help us to avoid certain counterexamples, but let's just read what the court says. They say that botanically speaking, tomatoes are the fruit of a vine, just as are cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas. But in the common language of the people, whether sellers or consumers of provisions, all these are vegetables which are grown in kitchen gardens and which, whether eaten, cooked, or raw, are like potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, cauliflower, cabbage, celery, and lettuce, usually served at dinner in, with, or after the soup, meats, or fish, which constitute the principal part of the repast, and not, like fruits generally, as dessert. Now, look, of course, this is a generality. The judges here use the term usually, which means that if you're just to take stock about the ways in which these things are typically used, they're typically used in this way. And I think that's right. I see a lot of, you know, meat-based dishes that have, tomato stock or something like that, a savory stock that we made from vegetables. It's a principle of French cooking to have kind of a mirepoix, which is your carrot, celery, and onion mix that's sauteed. That's usually served with some meats or fish, right? But of course, you might think of counterexamples as well. You might have thought that rhubarb was a vegetable, but sometimes we make pies out of rhubarb, don't we? Sometimes we make pies out of sweet potatoes. Sometimes we make bread out of, I'm sorry, a cake out of carrots, right? We have carrot cake. And in contrast, sometimes we eat fruits with the repast, don't we? Sometimes we have apples that are served with pork chops, although it's not really my favorite dish. And there are probably other examples as well. I was recently in Kazakhstan and I had some Azerbaijani plov there. And the plov was served with rice, meat, and then dried apricots and raisins, which was kind of odd. So I'm not saying that there aren't counterexamples to this kind of thinking, but just think within yourself about all the meals you've had. And I think there is this kind of pattern that emerged where a vegetable is something that typically is served with a more savory part of the dish, and a fruit usually is something that's eaten as a dessert or as kind of a sweet treat. And typically, when it seems to me that vegetables are used to um, be part of it is, excuse me, be part of a dessert, there's typically some added sugar involved there. So I don't know. Um, the judges have taken judicial notice of the common knowledge that vegetables are usually part of the meal in this way. They aren't served as a dessert. And so, since there's this common understanding of what it is to be a vegetable, then it's fair for the wharf master to collect tax on tomatoes as a vegetable, because everybody knows that vegetables has this common meaning which differs from its botanical meaning, and the court is not beholden to the dictionary definitions of uh, a tomato or a fruit or a vegetable or something like that. So I don't know what you think about this case, but I think it's interesting. I think it's a little bit of a circus, and I think it is kind of entertaining to think about the way in which you might have two different conceptions of something, but which one will win? Well, the ordinary language conception will kind of trump a more specialized technical definition in certain contexts, specifically those relating to the taxes. A more pessimistic read on the case is that the government will always take their taxes no matter what, but perhaps we needn't go that far. One thing you might think about as we conclude this lecture, which is very short because the case is very short. Back in the olden days, the good old days, rather, cases were about 4 to 5 pages in length, and this continues on the tradition. Somewhere over time, they've become very bloated, hundreds and hundreds of pages, but in the good old days, at least, you only needed 4 pages to get your point across. I'd like for you to compare this case, though, to what we just learned about in Smith versus United States. Recall that in that case, the majority's approach was essentially to look at a dictionary definition of the term use, and then basically sit down on that definition for the remainder of the legal analysis. In contrast, here, the court seems very unimpressed by dictionary definitions. They've simply gone with the way a term is used in ordinary language. And I think there's something admirable about the way in which the judges have proceeded in Nix versus Hedden. And I think there's something unappealing about the way the judges have proceeded in Smith versus United States. And that's because lexicographers, though they're excellent at what they do, oftentimes fail to capture the nuances of certain terms as they're used in ordinary language. And so while dictionaries often are very helpful aids in understanding a term and its extensions, oftentimes use diverges from the way in which a word is defined. And a term might often have a more specialized or nuanced use that doesn't quite match up to its dictionary definition. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. I've represented the argument here in its very basic form. I hope it was sort of fun for you to think about, and I hope you have a nice rest of your holiday. I'll see you next time.